The design of planned attacks on buildings inside the U.S. and how operatives were directed to carry them out. That is valuable information for those responsibility to protect the American people. He told us the operatives had been instructed to ensure that the explosives went off at a point that was high enough to prevent people trapped above from escaping. He gave us information that helped uncover Al-Qaeda cells' efforts to obtain biological weapons.
This is Building 7, a 47-story skyscraper that fell on the afternoon of September 11th.
The government says that fire brought it down. However, 1,500 architects and engineers concluded it was a controlled demolition.
Over 6,000 of my fellow service members have given their lives.
And thousands of my fellow first responders are dying.
I'm not a conspiracy theorist.
I'm a structural engineer.
I'm a New York City correction officer.
I'm an Air Force pilot.
I'm a father who lost his son.
We're Americans, and we deserve...
I lost my husband.
My son.
My uncle.
My nephew. September 11th, 2001.
Most people don't know a third tower fell that day.
The government says fire brought it down.
The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fires.
I, along with 1,400 other architects and engineers,
have found the government's conclusion to be physically impossible.
Impossible.
We need the truth about what happened that day.
Go to rememberbuilding7.org.
Why it fell, why it matters, and what you can do.
The peace symbol adopted by the drug flower children of the 60s was designed by Gerald Holtham, who was commissioned by One World Government salesman Bertrand Russell. The symbol was never designed as a symbol of peace, but as a symbol of death. It is actually a cross turned upside down with the arms broken and is used by Satanists and in Druid witchcraft. In Germany, the symbol is known as the Death Rune and is found on tombstones of Hitler's Nazi SS officers. CIA's team of ex-Nazis and Skull and Bonesmen financed and trained Osama bin Laden, who pushed the Russians out of Afghanistan by 1989. The CIA then trained and installed the ruthless Taliban regime to run the booming opium trade. After a decade, the long friendship between America and the Taliban suddenly turned ugly. At a meeting held on December 4th, 1997 at Unocal headquarters, American oil men made a proposal to the Taliban about building a pipeline through Afghanistan. Rothschild Shell Oil and Rockefeller's Exxon Oil had invested billions in the Kazakhstan oil and gas reserves just north of Afghanistan. Now they needed a pipeline to transport it to the Persian Gulf. The Taliban demanded a bigger cut and turned down the proposal. Suddenly, the banksters' American-controlled media were calling the Taliban monsters, evildoers, and cruel villains who beat up on women. On July 4th, 1999, President Clinton froze the Taliban's U.S. assets and bank accounts and imposed trade sanctions on Afghanistan. By February 2001, the Taliban destroyed most of Afghanistan's opium crops. In May, Secretary of State Colin Powell announced a gift of 43 million U.S. taxpayers' dollars to the Taliban. He called it a reward to the Taliban for destroying the opium crops, but members of the new George W. Bush White House knew the Taliban would use the 43 million for more sinister purposes.
Larger issue is not just not connecting the dots, but not getting the dots. Why was it that CIA was unable to collect information for years inside Afghanistan? When they had authority to kill bin Laden for over 2.5 years, why were they unable to kill him or his lieutenants? Why didn't they have a better capability to do something about it at the source?
Could it be that the bankster-supported U.S. administration is controlling both sides of the war on terror? Before the first plane ever even hit the first tower on 911, A massive U.S., British, and NATO troop buildup was already organized and positioned for an attack on Israel's enemies, opium-rich Afghanistan and oil-rich Iraq.
And there's an old poster out west, as I recall, that said, "Wanted, dead or alive."
With no solid proof of who was responsible for 9/11, George Bush Jr. attacked the poverty-stricken, war-ravaged country of Afghanistan only 4 weeks after 9/11. The U.S. and British military dropped 12,000 bombs on thousands of buildings and homes, pounding them into dust and rubble and killing 8,000 Afghan people. 20,000 more people died from war-related cold, starvation, and disease. Nobody made a big-budget TV production out of the massacre with a God Bless Afghanistan movie score. The U.S.-British war on Afghanistan left behind millions of starving people and thousands of women who are still veiled, still homeless, and still penniless.
Afghanistan is the world's largest producer of opium and now the world's largest producer of heroin.
دې لد دا ده چې 14 کاله دلته جنگ تیر شوی، زراعت تباه شوی، شفاخانې تباه شوي، تجارت تباه شوی، تعلیمي ادارې تباه شوي، مکتبونه تباه شوي، سرکونه تباه دي، ولږه ده، فقر ده، خلک بله چاره نه لري څه وکړي.
There can never be peace and democracy in Afghanistan. Why? Because peace and democracy would expose and cut off corporate America's opium and heroin trade at the source. So what was the payoff for the U.S.-British war on Afghanistan? 1, the uncooperative Taliban warlords got kicked out and replaced by the cooperative Northern Alliance warlords. 2, opium and heroin production and revenues skyrocketed. 3, Afghanistan got a new leader named Hamid Karzai, who just happens to be an ex-employee of Unocal Oil. 3, America got permission to build their oil and gas pipeline through Afghanistan. And 4, the Bush administration's favorite excuse for war, Osama bin Laden, was allowed to escape. America's second favorite excuse for war, Saddam Hussein, has always been America's patsy. In the 1980s, the United States supported Iraq's invasion of its neighbor, Iran, to stop the spread of Iran's Islamic Revolution. America played both sides of the Iran-Iraq war by supplying Saddam with chemical and biological weapons of mass destruction, and at the same time, America secretly sold weapons to Iran and illegally diverted the money to the Contra-revolutionaries in Central America.
During the war, the United States sent a special envoy to see Saddam in 1983. He was Donald Rumsfeld, now the U.S. Defense Secretary. The two men discussed how to reinforce Iraq against a common enemy. This was at a time when Iraq was using chemical weapons on Iranian troops. U.S. companies were supplying components with Washington's knowledge.
By 1990, President George Bush Sr. tricked Iraq into another war with another oil-rich neighbor, Kuwait. How? By supplying Kuwait with horizontal drills that could reach beneath the border of Iraq and siphon oil from Iraq's oil fields. Kuwait used the U.S.-made drills to steal 300,000 barrels of oil per day from Iraq, worth over $3 billion annually.
The fuse was lit, and Kuwait did nothing to put it out. They pumped oil without restraint from Rumaila oil field, which was accessible to both Kuwait and Iraq, and they exceeded OPEC quotas, flooding the market and driving prices even lower.
George Bush Sr. officially promised not to interfere in Iraq's legitimate oil battle with Kuwait, but when Saddam's army entered Kuwait to defend their oil reserves, Bush pounced on them.
Our goal is not the conquest of Iraq. It is the liberation of Kuwait.
America disposed of its toxic waste problem by building radioactive depleted uranium right into their bombs and dropping them on Iraq. Bush Sr. not only devastated and poisoned Iraq's water systems and infrastructure, he weakened the economies of both Kuwait and Iraq, collected giant profits from rationed Iraqi food for oil programs, and landed massive rebuilding contracts in Kuwait. Bush Sr. followed up the Gulf War with 10 long years of deadly trade sanctions that killed another 1.5 million Iraqi people, including 600,000 children who were cut off from medical supplies.
In a bookstore in the United States today, you can find 50 books celebrating different aspects of the war and how grand it all was. And you only find one that points out that this was a war crime, that demonstrates the evidence that shows that we deliberately targeted civilians and killed more than 250,000 people in Iraq.
You'll be fighting not to conquer anybody, but to liberate people.
In March 2003, President George Bush Jr. launched the second Gulf War. The war on Iraq wasn't about revenge for 9/11, since not one of the 19 accused terrorists were Iraqi citizens. It wasn't about weapons of mass destruction, which inspectors hadn't found. It wasn't even about Saddam Hussein, who had been financed into power by the U.S. in the first place and who got his chemical and biological weapons from American companies. No, the U.S. wars against Iraq and against Afghanistan were about mass murder and piracy. They were about big weapons sales, big oil, big pipelines, big drugs, and big rebuilding contracts. They were about colonizing the Middle East and moving 2 giant steps closer to world domination.
Come out!